My sister-in-law was laughing when I walked through the front door. Then she saw my face, and the whole room went quiet. I don't sleep well anymore. I haven't since the night I got my mother's voicemail. Her voice shaking so badly I had to replay it 3 times just to understand what she was saying. By the time I did, I was already pulling clothes out of my closet and throwing them into a bag. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because this story doesn't make sense without it. My parents came to Canada from the Philippines in the early 90s with almost nothing. My father worked construction in Winnipeg through winters that would make most people quit on the spot. My mother cleaned offices downtown from 6 in the morning until early afternoon, then came home and cooked dinner like it was nothing. They shared one car between them for 11 years. They never complained. Not once, not in front of us anyway. I'm the older of 2 children. My brother is 4 years younger than me. Growing up, we were close enough, the way siblings are when they share a bedroom and have no choice. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being close and started just being related. By the time I finished university, we were polite strangers at Christmas dinner. I studied accounting at the University of Manitoba, stayed in Winnipeg for my articling, then moved to Calgary for a senior role at a mid-sized firm when I was 27. I was careful with money, obsessively careful, honestly. I maxed my TFSA every year starting at 22. I drove a used Civic until it had over 200,000 kilometers on it. I brought lunch to work every day for 3 years straight. People at the office used to tease me about it. I didn't do any of that because I was miserable. I did it because I had a goal. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was coming up, and I had been quietly, privately planning something for almost 2 years. They had talked about retiring to a small town, somewhere quieter than Winnipeg, somewhere with a yard, somewhere my dad could have a garden. They'd looked at properties in the Interlake region of Manitoba, out near Lake Winnipeg. Beautiful area, peaceful, cottage country, but year-round livable. I found a property in a small town called Gimli. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a big backyard backing onto a trail that led down to the lake. It needed some work, new windows, updated heating, a bathroom renovation, but the bones were solid. The asking price was just under $390,000. With the renovation budget I'd set aside, the total came to roughly $420,000. I paid for it in full. No mortgage. I had been saving for this specific purpose for almost a decade. I told no one, not my friends, not my colleagues, especially not my brother. The plan was to drive my parents to Gimli on their anniversary weekend under the pretense of a family lunch. I'd rented out a little restaurant in town for the afternoon. After lunch, I was going to hand my mother an envelope with a photo of the house and the keys inside. The deed was already in their names. Both of them, joint tenancy, registered with the province. I'd worked with a real estate lawyer in Winnipeg to make sure everything was airtight. I arrived in Winnipeg 2 days before the anniversary. I stayed at a hotel because I wanted to keep the surprise intact. I had dinner with my parents that first evening and everything felt normal. My dad was talking about a documentary he'd watched about migratory birds. My mother kept refilling my water glass even though I hadn't finished what was in it. It was an ordinary Thursday night. My brother didn't come to dinner. He said he was busy. I wasn't surprised. The next morning, I drove out to Gimli alone to do a final walkthrough. The renovations had finished 2 weeks earlier. Standing in that kitchen, new countertops, the afternoon light coming through the window above the sink, I thought about my mother's hands, how rough they'd gotten over the years, and I had to sit down on the floor for a minute and just breathe. I drove back to Winnipeg that evening feeling something I can only describe as complete, like a chapter closing the right way. Then I checked my phone. 14 missed calls, 6 from my mother, 4 from a number I didn't recognize, 2 from my brother, which was unusual enough on its own that I felt something cold move through my chest before I even pressed play. My mother's voice on the first message sounded like she was trying very hard to stay calm and not managing it. She said my brother and his wife had come to the house. She said they were talking about the property in Gimli. She said she didn't understand how they knew about it. I called her back immediately. She picked up on the first ring. What she told me came out in fragments, and I had to piece it together as she spoke. Apparently, my brother's wife had overheard a phone call. My mother had called the real estate lawyer's office a week earlier to ask a question about the deed registration, and my sister-in-law had been in the next room. She had heard the address. She had heard the word transferred, and she had told my brother. By the time I understood what was happening, my brother and his wife had been at my parents' house for most of the day. They were telling my parents that the property should be held as a family asset, that it made more sense for my brother's family to move in. He and his wife had 2 kids after all, and more space was a practical need. That I was single with no children and clearly didn't need a lakeside property. What my brother had apparently said, and this is the part that made my hands go numb, was that he was going to consult a lawyer about whether a family gift of this size could be considered a shared inheritance advance, and whether he had any claim to an equitable portion of the asset. He was 31 years old, had never once sent our parents money, had let them pay for his car insurance until he was 26, and he was talking about inheritance law. I got in my car and drove directly to my parents' house. I did not call ahead. When I opened the front door, my sister-in-law was mid-sentence, gesturing at my mother with the kind of confidence people have when they think no one is coming to challenge them. My brother was sitting at the kitchen table with his arms crossed. My mother was standing near the counter with her hands clasped together the way she does when she is trying not to cry. My sister-in-law saw me first. She stopped talking. My brother turned around. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then my brother said, "We were just talking." I looked at my mother. I said, "Are you okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were wet. I set my bag down on the floor and I sat down at the table. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these situations can look from the outside. I was not angry in the way that makes you loud. I was angry in the way that makes you very, very still. I asked my brother to explain, in his own words, what he believed he was entitled to. He talked for about 4 minutes. He said things about fairness. He said things about family. He mentioned his kids twice. He said that a gift of that size created an imbalance and that he was just trying to have a conversation about equity. When he finished, I asked him one question. I said, "What have you contributed to mom and dad in the last 5 years? Financially, practically, in any measurable way?" He didn't answer. I opened my bag and took out a folder. I had brought it with me from the hotel. I had been carrying it since I arrived in Winnipeg, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I had apparently anticipated that something like this might happen, even if I hadn't let myself fully think it through. Inside the folder was a copy of the title registration, both my parents' names, joint tenancy, no other parties, registered and certified. I also had a copy of the independent legal advice certificate my parents had signed when we finalized the transfer standard procedure in Manitoba for gifts of real property, confirming that both recipients understood the nature and terms of the transfer with outside pressure. I laid both documents flat on the table. I said, "There is no claim here. There is no legal basis for what you're describing. The property belongs to mom and dad, fully and without condition. If you retain a lawyer, the first thing they will tell you is exactly that, and you will have spent money to be told something I'm telling you right now for free." My sister-in-law said something about how I was being aggressive. I said I was being precise, and that she was welcome to note the difference. My brother looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at me. I don't know exactly what he was looking for. Some crack in it, maybe. Some detail he could use. There wasn't one. My mother made tea. I don't know why that detail has stayed with me as clearly as it has. But she walked to the kettle and filled it and turned it on. And that small, ordinary action felt like the bravest thing I had watched anyone do in a long time. My brother and his wife left about 20 minutes later. There was no dramatic exit. He just stood up and put on his jacket and said they'd talk more later, and I said that was fine, and they walked out the front door. After they left, my dad sat down heavily in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He said, "I didn't know any of this was happening. With the house? I didn't know you had done this." I said, "I know. I wanted to tell you properly. Tomorrow." He looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded slowly, and he didn't say anything else. And honestly, that was enough. The next day, their anniversary, we still drove to Gimli. I still had the envelope with the photo and the keys. I still handed it to my mother over lunch at the small restaurant I had booked, with the window overlooking the main street of town and the light coming in sideways and gold the way it does on October afternoons in Manitoba. My mother held the key in her palm for a long time without speaking. My dad asked if he could have a garden. I said the backyard was all his. After lunch, we walked over to the house together. My mother opened every cupboard in the kitchen. She ran her hand along the new countertop. She stood in the doorway of what would be her bedroom and just looked at it. My dad went straight to the back door and stepped out onto the small deck and stood there looking at the yard with his hands in his pockets. I stayed inside and watched them through the window. I want to tell you that everything resolved neatly after that, but that's not entirely true. My brother and I didn't speak for several months. When we eventually did talk, it was brief and careful. He did not apologize directly. He said something about having been in a difficult place financially, which I understood without accepting as an excuse. My sister-in-law and I have not spoken since that evening. My parents spent their first winter in Gimli. My mother joined a Filipino community group in the area. There's a small community out there, mostly families who've been in the Interlake region for decades. My dad built 3 raised garden beds before the ground froze and spent all winter planning what he was going to plant in the spring. I visited in February. The lake was frozen and the light on the snow was extraordinary. My mother made a roast caldo and we sat at the kitchen table for most of the afternoon. She kept touching the countertop the same way she had the first day, like she was still making sure it was real. I thought a lot about what my brother said that day. The word he used was fairness. I've turned it over and over, trying to find the version of events where he had a point, because I think it's important to genuinely try to do that before you decide someone was simply wrong. I can't find it. Fairness doesn't mean equal distribution regardless of contribution. Fairness means something closer to proportion. And what I gave my parents wasn't an asset to be divided. It was a thank you that had been building for 30 years. There's something I've learned, not just from this situation, but from years of watching how families handle money, which is my professional terrain as much as it is my personal one. Generosity without documentation is an invitation for reinterpretation. The moment something valuable is given, someone will try to reframe it. They'll use words like equity and fairness and family, and those words aren't wrong in themselves, but in these situations they're being used as crowbars. The thing that protected my parents wasn't my presence in that room. It was the paperwork. It was the lawyer. It was the independent legal advice certificate that cost $200 and took an afternoon and turned out to be the most important $200 I ever spent. A gift isn't leverage. It doesn't create obligation in the giver. It doesn't entitle bystanders to a portion of something they had no part in building. My mother called me last week. She said she had been sitting on the porch watching the lake, and she wanted me to know that she thinks about the fact that I spent years doing this for them, and she doesn't quite have words for it. I told her she didn't need any. She said, "You are a good daughter." I said, "You made it easy." That's not entirely true either. Nothing about this was easy. But some things are worth doing precisely because they aren't. I think about something my dad said to me the morning after we first saw the house together. We were drinking coffee on the back deck, and it was cold, and neither of us had said much, and he looked out at the yard and said, "In the Philippines, we had a saying, a house is not a house without someone who chose to make it one." He said my mother and he had been trying to make everywhere a home for 40 years. He said they finally had one. I don't have a tidy lesson to wrap around that. I just know that when I drove back to Calgary 2 days later, the weight I'd been carrying, the one I hadn't even fully acknowledged was gone. Some debts aren't financial, and some of them, if you're lucky and you work hard enough and you pay attention, you actually get to repay. Not every family will understand what we're doing when you set a boundary. Not everyone will accept that love is not a resource to be extracted, but you don't need them to understand. You just need the deed to say the right names, and ours did. I spent a lot of time thinking about what actually happened in that kitchen in Gimli. Not the argument, not the documents on the table, but the quieter thing underneath all of it. The question I keep coming back to is this: how does someone convince themselves that they're owed something they never helped build? I don't think my brother is a bad person in the way that word usually gets used. I think he made a series of small choices over many years: to take without tracking, to assume without asking, to treat generosity as a renewable resource with no conditions attached, and those choices accumulated into something he couldn't see clearly anymore. That's not evil. It's a failure of attention, and failures of attention, over time, have consequences that feel sudden even when they've been building for a decade. What I did for my parents wasn't heroic. I want to be honest about that. I had the income, I had the discipline, and I had the years. I made choices that cost me things: vacations I didn't take, a newer car I didn't buy, evenings I spent with spreadsheets instead of friends. Those weren't sacrifices in any dramatic sense. They were just priorities, chosen deliberately, held consistently. That's what people mean when they talk about discipline. Not white-knuckling through misery, but deciding what actually matters and arranging your life around it without constantly renegotiating. My parents built everything they had on that same principle. They didn't have the language for it that I do, coming out of an accounting background. They just called it working hard and not spending what you don't have. But the structure underneath was identical. You decide what you're building toward. You protect it. You don't let anyone talk you out of it with words that sound reasonable but are really just asking you to give your priorities away. The piece I came to understand most clearly in the months after everything settled was this. The paperwork wasn't bureaucracy. It was integrity made visible. Every document I filed, every legal step I took, was just a way of saying in language the world recognizes that I meant what I said and I thought it through. My brother couldn't argue with it not because it was intimidating, but because it was simply true. You cannot negotiate with something that is fully, carefully, honestly done. There is a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up in grades or titles. It's the intelligence of following through, of doing the quiet work before anyone is watching, of treating the people who gave you everything as if they are worth the same effort you'd give to anything else you cared about getting right. I didn't save my parents' home with anything dramatic. I saved it with $200 of independent legal advice and years of paying attention. My mother still touches the countertop when she thinks no one is looking. My dad's garden came up this past spring. Tomatoes, green onions, a row of bitter melon along the back fence that reminded him of home. I think that's what it looks like when the right outcome arrives. Not loud, not cinematic, just a man standing in his own backyard in the morning light, hands in the soil, finally somewhere he belongs. That was always the whole point.